Vell, the Goblin. Chapter 1. The Last Warparty. The sun had passed its apex, as Vell sat and watched the remains of the war-party pass him by. Only a few short months before, when he had marched in the other direction, he had run his hand over this very stone. There had been more of his kin then, a lot more. The last vestiges of winter had still clung to the trees in the form of still melting snow, and the cold bite of the air had made him shiver every time he paused his marching gait. Now it was hot, and the slight breeze held the promise of rain coming down from the heights. The cycle was nearing the colder months again, and already the days were beginning to shorten, causing the summer flowers to begin to wilt. His fingers reflexively curled into the moss as he rested and watched the survivors of the tribe trudge the last half day back to the village. They were carrying injury and loot in equal measure. There were fewer of them each time the tribe marched. Barely more had gone on the warpath this year than had returned the last time the war march was called. The thoughts that were going through his mind at that moment had taken root 3 cycles before, after his first war party. Now, though, they were no longer a quiet voice at the back of his mind. Now they were full-fledged doubts that growled angrily behind his eyes. The other races saw him and his people as monsters, small-framed, vicious little killers and thieves, that never changed or acted in any way that would alter the perception in the minds of any that saw them. Vell was starting to think that was all his people were good for, killing and stealing. Dying too, he added, as he noted the trail of blood being left behind the small pack of his kin. They had no real culture beyond the next fight or ritual, and most goblins never really even met their parents. Despite living in the deep forest, his village always found an enemy to fight, or were paid in loot by others to fight their enemies. Even if there was no enemy to fight, the forest had enough dangers of its own to claim a few of his people each cycle. Vell watched the last of his people slowly walk past from where he sat, and remembered the return journey from his first war party. The sun was much higher in the sky that time, but the chill hung in the air the same. In the village, he was a hunter, nothing more and nothing less. He was not big enough to raise to a position of power within the tribe, and had not the mind for magic that the shamans of the tribe could weave to their normally nefarious purposes of the tribal chief. His frame was perfect, however, for stalking and ambushing creatures of the forest for food, or attacking the occasional patrol from a rival village or unfortunate traveller. The chief and his advising shamans were dead now, though, fallen in battle with the promise of power from a human mage who had used the goblins and orcs he had gathered as expendable soldiers in his campaign of destruction. It had failed, like the similarly half-mad dreams of so many others. It had been the promise of plunder or the threat of the other tribes uniting that kept Vell's people coming back for more. He was not old, or at least did not feel it. No one in the tribe really knew how old a goblin could grow, but in the nearly 20 winters he had seen, he knew that the brutal and dangerous conditions they were born to was normally only the background to the real danger that shortened the lives of his people. Battle, or beasts of the wild, both of which could be found within the territory the tribe called home without looking too hard, along with tribes of orcs and other goblins, kreslings, packs of wolves, prides of shade panthers, and a host of other things that could shorten the life of any creature that got too close. His mind returned to the calls for war the tribe had received. This time had been much like the last was. The tribe's warriors had been led to fight in a war that promised plunder by the old chief, who, in turn, had been convinced by the human mage with the red tattoo on his cheek and the bird thing on his shoulder. On the promise of power and wealth within his army they had marched and conquered. In the end, it was always the same. Vell's father and mother had both been in war bands, and had fallen together while he was still a whelp in the youngling pits. Goblin children grew up in what was effectively a hole in the ground. a place where fighting for position went hand in hand with the simple act of being a child of their race. A goblin was first a child of the tribe before they were a child of any named parent, and when news of his parents' deaths reached the tribe, it had not affected his future overmuch. Vell had grown up in the pits, learnt the language and harsh realities of the tribe's forest life until he was old enough to be of use for the tribe. It was all taught by the iron will of the whelp mothers and the matron, until one of the adults came by one day and said he needed an apprentice. His thin body, quick mind and hands marked him for an important task within the village. Vell had learnt the hunting ways under the tribe's hunt master and found a place hoping to feed the tribe until the day he had been called to war. The last time the tribe had marched to war, defeat had come so swiftly that almost none of the tribe had come away with any of their gathered loot, though the defeat had come with fewer casualties. A charge of humans on horses had smashed into them from behind, and everything had descended into a simple, panicked run. This time had been different. He had done well enough with loot, but the cost to the tribe had been high, with only a fraction of the tribe's fighters returning to the village. The rock that Vell sat on was beginning to warm to his body heat as he hopped down. The group had paused their march home, taking a breather as he had done, just along the trail from where he had sat and watched them pass. The feeling of being used, being a plaything for more powerful creatures, was making him grind his teeth. It had been an orc chieftain that had marched his parents off to war, and a scorch, one of those flame-born intelligent earth elementals that had taken the tribe to a war a few cycles before that. Fodder and spears for the wars of others. If a would-be conqueror needed soldiers and could find the tribe, and if the tribe had enough fighters to be of worth taking, but not so many that they could resist any insane orders, then they were put to use. Through force, fear, or through the promise of plunder, the tribe would march again and again. That was life for the diminutive goblin races. Tribe Korak of the Waterfall was shrinking. They had once boasted war parties of over 200 warriors in the time of Vell's parents. In these times, though, he was a member of a tribe with just over 100 of his kin, and that was before the last march. From that number, 70 had gone with the Mage's emissary to help him carve out a portion of the wilderness from the Rendell, a group of humans who had settled in the western reaches in the time of Vell's parents. From 70, only 17 were returning with him now. The tribe had been blessed with few whelps before Vell had left, and he doubted that many had been born while he was away. Recovering this tribe's strength would take time, cycles Vell was not sure the tribe had. It was unlikely that they could defend their territory from the creatures that prowled the forest, not to mention the other tribes that Vell's people had once kept at bay with such ease. The only positive was that the other goblin and orc tribes in the area had been part of the same campaign, suffering the same victories and defeats, and would not be eager to risk further losses for a few years at least. Of the other dangers in the forest, none of those had suffered the same losses. He stood at the back of the group and watched them as they ate what little food they had and sipped at the thin stream that had carved its path through the forest floor, when a movement behind him made him tense and peer around the tree that he leant against. He relaxed almost immediately. He watched Fruk limp past him and give a flinch as Vell shifted his weight and Fruk noticed him. Expecting perhaps to be attacked in his moment of weakness, Fruk nearly stumbled into the others, eliciting a chorus of growls. Indeed, Vell could not deny the impulse to impose his will on his weakened kin was there in his mind, that instinctive urge to dominate for no better reason than he could. They would soon be home. A half-day's travel at most, and they would reach the village. They could move at speed in the dense undergrowth of the forest. They could, like most intelligent races, walk straight and upright, but would normally walk heavily hunched over, and would move with an almost sideways lope, employing hands in the process of walking or running to aid moving over fallen trees and rocks in the thick foliage that blocked their path. The war party around Vell wore a patchwork of leather jerkins and hide shorts of one design or another that had not always been properly prepared for the purpose before being applied to the goblin's body. Some wore padded armour that had been cut from more functional versions recovered from the battlefield. Most carried or dragged a simple spear, maybe a knife or two on a belt made from uncured hide or woven vine root. Including Vell, 2 others sported crude short bows clasped at their sides, and a quiver with a few rough arrows rattling in the near empty holders. Some, like Vell, carried sacks with what plunder they could save. Before their flight from the disastrous battle had seen nearly 50 of their number dead in seconds. As the cavalry ploughed through, a lance missing Vell by a hair's breadth and spearing the tribe's huntmaster who had been standing behind him. Goblins were not a brave race by nature, as they would run from almost any foe that outnumbered them when the chance presented itself. Being smaller and normally weaker than the average human, goblins had trouble dealing with opponents on a one-to-one basis, and relied heavily on ganging up on a victim and overpowering them with the mass of the horde. When goblins were involved, an attack rarely hit from the front. It was normally a long-shafted spear or even an arrow that would strike from behind that made a killing blow when the goblins attacked. It was a general rule that the biggest and strongest of the tribe became chief, with little thought for the smallest and weakest of the group. Greed and status ruled above all, however, so when the sudden sound of battle echoed through the trees to the east, as the group made its southward trek, having looped around the Ridgeway crater on their way home, their instincts were torn between blind flight and curiosity that could lead to finding more plunder. Zelen, one of the younger warriors, scurried a little towards the sound of fighting echoing through the trees, and paused on a long fallen tree, sniffing and turning his head to listen, leaving the bulk of the group behind him. Vell was also listening, his ears turning slightly, trying to pick out the sounds faintly echoing through the forest from far off. Vell had heard it too moments before the others started to react. He followed Zelen to the log and moved to the right of the younger goblin, his long wide ears picking up much in the forest of his homeland, and Vell's trained hunter mind could sort through the information well. But it was his nose that gave him the first clue to the commotion as the wind shifted. "Orc scent," Vell chattered in the quick, chirping language of his people, and noted the reaction of those around him as the smell of orc blood floated on the gentle breeze that was a friend to any good hunter. "Not need trouble," said Bryn, a tall and wide goblin who would probably end up taking the mantle of chief on their return to the village. He was easily the largest of those who remained, and his mate, if she still lived, was the village lawmaster, which would aid his ascension. "I go scout," Vell could hear himself saying, before he even realized that he really did want to go and take a look, half stunned by the sound of his own voice and eagerness. "You think there's plunder to be found, Huntmaster?" Bryn was asking him, misunderstanding Vell's desires. The use of the title caught Vell a little off guard. It was true he was the best of the remaining hunters now that Huntmaster Gwael and the other she-goblin Hessa were dead, but he had not thought of his elevation to that position before that moment. Not to mention, it was not guaranteed that Bryn would be the next chief. It was more likely that he would try to get Vell on side before he staked his claim by using the title as an unofficial promotion. "No," Vell answered at length, still trying to pick through the implications of his new position and the other implications of a battle taking place so close to their home. "Might be trouble for tribe home," he finished, finally looking at Bryn. The other goblins sneered at Vell's comment, not fully believing the statement, and Vell could only think Bryn was a fool at that moment. The tribe was weak, with only a few birthing mothers and fewer warriors, whelps and younglings having been left at the village. In total, maybe another 30 of the Coric tribe, on top of the survivors here, still drew breath, with few of those being birth mothers or even being mated. "Foolish," Bryn said with a sharp shake of the head. "We not need fight," he finished, slapping a hand over his chest, and Vell had to agree with that at least. But still, it grated on him that only a meal's length away from the village, 2 foes were fighting each other on Korak tribe's territory.